everybody, welcome to Reaper Toolbox. I'm Ann Forster, Reaper staff painter and creator of the Master Series paint line, and today we are going to talk about the science of thinning your paint. So first of all, why do we thin? Well, for one thing, let's take Mr. Dwarf here. We're going to have the Grudge demo for us today. He's looking a little patchwork at this point, but we're going to deal with it. For one thing, when you are trying to brush the paint onto the model, if you thin it a little bit, it's going to brush on more smoothly. It's not going to fight you as much. It's going to go a lot farther. Also, this is slightly thin paint. You can see that it is a little more transparent, so you may need to add a little bit more in terms of layers. Like after you put your first coat on, you may need to add a second one. So you're like, well, Ann, that's more work. Why should I do it at all? Well, for one thing, it's not going to clog detail as easily to do this thinned paint application. It's really not that much work to go back and touch it up afterwards. And in general, you're going to have a lot more control over where the paint goes. You're going to be able to get it in a little tiny cracks and crevices because, as you can see, it's real thin on your brush. You're not dealing with a big glob of sticky paint trying to move it around. So thinner paint gives you more control as long as you're not overloading your brush. If one coat doesn't cover, as stated, you just go back and you put a second coat on. And what this is going to do is give you a very smooth, even coat, because what happens is that the paint self-levels when it's this thin. You're not going to get globs. You're not going to get, weird areas where it's thicker and thinner. Instead, it's going to flow together and it's going to make a nice, smooth coat that looks great to start with and gives you the best possible start on your miniature. The other reason you want to thin your paint is that many techniques only give good results with thinned paint. Things like this include washes, glazing, obviously, you're thinning your paint a lot for those, right? But also layering. If you try to layer with thicker paint, you're probably not going to get as fine a brush stroke, and you're going to have to make your colors a lot closer together. You're not going to get as smooth of a blend as you will if you thinned your paint. There's also a few techniques like underpainting, using underpainting for textures, which maybe we'll go into at some point. But essentially it's putting down a texture underneath and then glazing colors over it to bring it up and to make it a richer kind of under texture. Like people use underpainting for tattoos all the time, things like that. Really cool stuff, right? But you've got to use thinned paint with that. You really have no choice. So learning to thin your paint then is really an important part of becoming a better miniature painter, so that you can do all the cool things that you want to do with miniature painting. So all right, how much do we thin? Well, there's definitely a too much point where you break the paint. And by breaking the paint, so let's look at some paint here. So why does paint break? Because we've all thinned our paint a lot when we're doing a wash and then had it dry really funny, right? With like little rings, or it wanted to kind of pop out of the cracks, so things like that. Or maybe it didn't stick to the surface very well. So what you're dealing with paint is resins. And the resins I'm talking about are like acrylic or latex, right? Everybody's heard about acrylic latex paint. So those resins essentially glob onto each other, and that's what holds your paint together. That's what makes it dry as a nice even layer. When you start adding a lot of water for like glazing or washing, what happens is you've added so much water that you break the bonds between those resins. They fly apart, and that's why you get that weird particulate or drying on the upper surfaces and not sticking to the cracks. That's why that happens. So when you're dealing with thin paint applications that do break, and I'll tell you right now, glazing is one of them. When you want to put a really thin, let's show you on the Dwarf here. This is actually a very good glazing consistency. You can see that it's pretty much just colored water, right? This would normally break the paint, and yet it's what you want when glazing. So we'll take Mr. Grudge, and I'll show you kind of what glazing looks. When you use glazing, you're really trying to either smooth out brush strokes or tint an area, where if I decided that I wanted some rosy color or some more tan color here on Mr. Dwarf, then I would glaze this color over the top of the skin tone. See how that warms it up? But the key here is that because the paint is broken, because I've thinned it so much, I can't let it pool, because then it's going to dry very oddly, because I know that I've broken those resin bonds. So there, you can see how glazing really warms up and tans out that skin tone. If I decided I wanted him a lot tanner and less pasty, I could glaze over the top of this skin tone. And you notice that glazing also is very fast, right? It's not taking me as much time as it would to, say, apply a whole nother base coat. It's just letting me kind of boom and get that color down, and now I can move on. So glazing definitely is a great technique, but it does actually break the bonds. That's how thin you want it. Now, washes are a different beast. for washes, you want the paint to be a little thicker than glazing because you want it to be able to pool. And so you don't want to break the paint. You don't want to take it that far. So let's demo a wash here. And I'm going to take my paint of a second ago that I was using for glazing, and I'm going to add a little bit more of the core paint to it. And just in case you're wondering what color this is Tarnished Copper, which is one of the Kickstarter paints from Bones 3, and it's 9305. And my basic skin tone was more like rosy skin, I believe, 9068. So you see that Tarnished Copper can actually make a pretty good shadow for a rosy skin. It might be a rosy skin highlight. It's one or the other. But okay, so the thing with washes is that you want it to be a little thicker, and you want to just pretty much smear it on all over as quickly as you can because you want it to pool. So we're going to put this guy up here, and we're just going to go from top to bottom, and I'm keeping it really thick, and I'm going to let it go down. And what I want is I want it to fill in all these cracks. And then while it's still wet, I can rinse out my brush really quick. And if I want to, I can actually suck up some of this excess wash, so it's not quite as much. Because it's going to take it a little while to dry since there's so much of it and it's watery. I probably should have used a bigger brush for this. Normally I use as big a brush as I can get away with. Now keep in mind also, though this may look really strong, washes made with paint always dry lighter than they look. So this will actually dry a little bit lighter than this. Yeah, I put a lot of that on. Now another thing that we'll talk about right here is then additives. Why do people use additives to thin their paint? Well, one of those additives, and I actually used it in this mixture, is brush-on sealer. Our brush-on sealer, which is 9107, is actually a good substitute for matte medium, which is an artist product that is also used for thinning, and what it does is the same thing. Remember how I said that when you thin your paint, you eventually break those bonds between resins, and then the paint doesn't act the way you want it to? Well, adding a matte medium or a brush-on sealer to your paint mix when you're thinning it essentially adds more resin without adding more color. So it lets you thin your paint to a lighter consistency like this, more transparent, but it also, since it's adding resins, it means you can thin it a little more without breaking the paint. So that's really useful. And a good wash recipe for all of Master Series, though you want to tweak it to what you're exactly doing, is 3 drops of water, 3 drops of brush-on sealer, and 1 drop of Master Series paint. So while we're on it, what about flow improver? Why do people use flow improver? Well, one of the reasons that you want to thin your paint when you're painting details is that it allows you to get a thinner, finer brush stroke. So like when I thin my paint and I take a lot of paint off of my brush, I can do super fine. Look at how fine that is. Super fine lines. So if I were doing scratches on this armor or dings or little tiny freehand, between the fact that I'm using a very good brush and the fact that I've got very little paint on my brush and that I've got my paint thinned so much, I can create those absolutely really tiny little lines. So when I'm using thicker paint, I have a lot harder time, notice how wobbly that is, and I have a lot harder time doing a really thin stroke. So this is why thinner paint helps you with things like layering, where you want a really thin, transparent stroke and you're building it up, is because you can do a much finer stroke when you've thinned your paint. The other thing to remember is that when you're using really thin paint, the other reason that it goes so far is that it doesn't dry as fast on your brush. You've got a lot of water in there, and so it's not going to start getting gummy like thicker paint will, nearly as fast. So once again, this enables you to do a really thin stroke or a lot of really fine details without worrying about that. And that's why thinning your paint is also good, at least just a little, when you're doing things like eyeballs. Because then, you have to hit that pupil, you want to be able to do that little dot. So if you just thin your paint a little bit, it can help you get that dot. See, my paint is still pretty thick. See how hard I had to press to get even that tiny dot off of my brush? And look at my brush tip, it's like hooked. So I need a thinner paint to do that dot. So it's all about making things easier for yourself. Thinner paint's just a little easier to work with. Now I can do, let's see. There we go. Now we can do a nice micro dot, a nice pupil, if it were black, and not have to worry about it. Plus, my paint is still wet, so I can continue doing dots. It lasts for a while. If I had used thicker paint, I would have maybe that one dot. That would be it. So that's another reason why thinner paint is really useful. So flow improvers, I got a little bit off topic, so I'll give you one last thing about flow improvers and why they're useful. You see how hard it was for the paint to come off of the brush when it's thicker. Flow improver is a thing called a surfactant, and it is meant to break surface tension on your paint. So what that means is, you know, part of what's fighting me here, if I have thicker paint on my brush, is surface tension, right? It's a thick globby paint, it holds together really well. But when you add a little flow improver to that, it breaks the surface tension, just like dish soap does in oily water, and the paint will come off your brush a lot easier. So all of MSP paint is formulated to have flow improver already added. But if you're doing fine details or fine freehand, and you really find that your paint is having a hard time coming off your brush consistently, you can certainly add a little bit of extra flow improver. All right, I think that's it for today. I hope you guys learned something. I hope it was fun. I hope it'll make you think a little bit more about thinning your paint. This is Anne, and this has been Reaper Toolbox, signing off. Have a great day.